The shadows of dusk stretched long across the dusty Arizona street as Desmond Hayes rode in, his face weathered by time and silence, a man known more for the tales others told about him than any words he'd spoken himself in the last 5 years. The year was 1876, and the small town of Pineshadow was just another stop on a journey that seemed to have no destination. Desmond dismounted his chestnut stallion with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. The townsfolk eyed him warily, his reputation as the silent gunslinger from Kansas having preceded him. Few knew the true story behind his silence, and fewer still had ever heard his voice. The last time Desmond had spoken more than a few necessary words was when he'd buried his wife and son after the raid that had taken everything from him. He led his horse to the hitching post outside the town's only saloon, the Rusty Nail. The familiar sounds of piano music, drunken laughter, and clinking glasses spilled out onto the street. Desmond adjusted his worn Stetson, his calloused fingers briefly touching the silver wedding band he still wore on a leather cord around his neck. The saloon fell quiet as he pushed through the batwing doors. He nodded at the barkeep, holding up one finger, his usual way of ordering whiskey. The room gradually resumed its chatter as he took his drink to a corner table, his back to the wall, eyes surveying the room with the cautious gaze of a man who'd survived by anticipating trouble. "They say you've killed 20 men," a young cowpoke slurred from a nearby table. "Say you ain't spoken a word since you gunned down the last of the Williams gang." Desmond didn't acknowledge the comment. The tales grew taller with each town he passed through. In truth, he'd killed only when necessary, and the Williams gang had nothing to do with his silence. But the legend served him well, keeping most trouble at a distance. The whiskey burned familiar fire down his throat. 3 glasses would be enough to dull the memories, to quiet the ghosts that haunted his dreams. Then he'd seek a room at the boarding house and be gone by morning, continuing a journey with no end in sight. As he reached for his 3rd glass, the saloon doors swung open again. The piano stopped mid-note, and a hush fell over the room that was different from the one that had greeted Desmond. He looked up. A woman stood in the doorway. She was dressed simply in a travel-worn blue dress, her honey-brown hair partially hidden beneath a modest bonnet. But it wasn't her unexpected entrance into a place frequented almost exclusively by men that silenced the room. It was the scars. They started at her right temple, trailing down her cheek like lightning frozen in flesh, disappearing into the high collar of her dress only to emerge again on her right hand. Burn scars, Desmond recognized immediately, the kind that came from being trapped in a fire. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, surveyed the room with neither shame nor challenge, simply purpose. She approached the bar with steady steps. "I'm looking for Dr. Wallace," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The barkeep gestured toward a gray-haired man at a table near the window. "That's him there, miss. Doc, you got a visitor." The doctor looked up, surprise evident on his weathered face. "I'm Wallace. What can I do for you?" "My name is Tabitha James. I believe you received a letter from Dr. Ellison in Santa Fe about my arrival." Her voice carried across the quiet room. Recognition dawned on the doctor's face. "Miss James, yes. I wasn't expecting you until next week." He stood, gathering his coat. "Please, let me take you to the clinic. It's no place for a lady in here." Tabitha nodded, turning to leave, but not before her gaze briefly met Desmond's across the room. There was something in that momentary connection, a recognition not of faces but of wounds carried within, that made Desmond's hand tighten around his glass. As she left, the saloon erupted in low murmurs. "Lord Almighty, did you see her face? Poor creature. What do you reckon happened?" Her doc was bringing in a nurse from Santa Fe. Didn't expect no scarred woman, though. Desmond drained his whiskey and stood. He'd intended to stay the night, but something about the town suddenly felt confining. He'd sleep under the stars tonight, he decided, dropping coins on the table for his drinks. Outside, the night had fully claimed the sky. As Desmond untied his horse, he noticed Tabitha and the doctor walking toward a small building at the end of the street, a lantern illuminating their path. He watched until they disappeared inside, then mounted his stallion and rode toward the outskirts of town. But as the miles stretched behind him, sleep eluded Desmond. His mind kept returning to those scars, to the unflinching way she'd carried them. Before dawn broke, he found himself riding back toward Pineshadow, drawn by something he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge. The morning brought the bustle of a town awakening. Desmond led his horse to the livery stable, deciding to stay a few more days. He told himself it was the promise of work the ranch hands needed sign outside the general store, and not the scarred woman who had somehow unsettled his carefully constructed solitude. By midday, Desmond had secured work at the Murphy Ranch, 2 miles outside of town. The ranch owner, a gruff widower named Patrick Murphy, asked few questions beyond whether Desmond could ride and rope. His silence was an asset here, where actions spoke louder than words. It was 3 days before Desmond encountered Tabitha again. He'd ridden into town for supplies, his saddlebags empty of coffee and ammunition. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he spotted her emerging from the doctor's clinic, medical bag in hand. She noticed him too, pausing briefly before approaching. Up close, her scars were more pronounced, the skin puckered and shiny in places. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, clear, direct, unashamed. "You're the man from the saloon," she said. "The one they whisper about." Desmond nodded, his usual response to most interactions. "I'm Tabitha James, the new nurse." She extended her hand, the scarred one, as if testing him. Desmond hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, her hand surprisingly warm. "Do you have a name? Or shall I call you the silent stranger like everyone else does?" A hint of amusement colored her voice. Desmond cleared his throat, the sound rusty from disuse. "Desmond," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "Hayes." Surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by a small smile. "Well, Mr. Hayes, it seems the rumors of your muteness have been greatly exaggerated." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the exchange but strangely reluctant to end it. "I should let you get to your errands," she said after a moment. "It was nice to properly meet you." As she turned to leave, Desmond found himself speaking again. "They don't bother you? The stairs?" Tabitha paused, looking back at him. "They did once. Now I find people's reactions to my scars tell me more about them than they learn about me." She studied him for a moment. "You didn't stare. Not the way others do. I've seen worse." The words came out before he could stop them. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe you have." With a nod, she continued down the boardwalk toward the doctor's residence attached to the clinic. Desmond watched her go, aware that he'd spoken more in those few minutes than he had in months. The realization unsettled him as he entered the store, nodding at the proprietor who seemed surprised to see the silent cowboy back in town. That night, camped in the bunkhouse at the Murphy Ranch with 3 other hired hands, Desmond lay awake, his thoughts circling back to Tabitha James. There was something about her directness, her lack of pretense, that had pierced the armor of his silence. He rolled onto his side, determined to put the encounter behind him. Tomorrow would bring hard work and the blessed simplicity of physical labor. There was no room in his life for complications. But fate had other plans. The accident happened just after noon the next day. One of the younger hands, a boy named Jimmy, barely 18, was thrown from a half-broken Mustang. The horse's hoof caught him in the chest as it bolted, and the boy's scream cut through the air like a knife. Ride for the doctor, Murphy shouted, kneeling beside the fallen boy. Desmond was already mounting up, his horse the fastest on the ranch. He rode hard into town, dust billowing behind him as he pushed his stallion to its limits. Within minutes, he was pulling up outside the clinic, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. He burst through the door to find Tabitha organizing medical supplies, alone in the front room. "Dr. Wallace?" he asked, breathing hard. "Out at the Jefferson farm. Mrs. Jefferson's time has come." She took in his disheveled appearance and the urgency in his eyes. "What's happened?" "Boy at Murphy's ranch. Horse kicked him in the chest. Bad." Tabitha moved with swift efficiency, gathering supplies into her medical bag. "How old is the boy?" 18, maybe. "Jimmy." She nodded, grabbing additional bandages. "I'll need a ride." Without hesitation, Desmond led her to his horse. "You ever ride double?" "I grew up on a ranch in Colorado. I can ride." She secured her medical bag to the saddle. Desmond mounted first, then extended his hand down to her. Tabitha took it, swinging up behind him with surprising grace for a woman in a dress. Her arms circled his waist as he turned the horse, and then they were galloping back toward the ranch, her body pressed against his by necessity and speed. They found Jimmy surrounded by the other hands, his face pale, lips tinged blue as he struggled for breath. Tabitha dismounted quickly, kneeling beside him without hesitation. "Help me get his shirt open," she instructed Desmond, who knelt opposite her. Together they exposed the boy's chest, already darkening with a massive bruise over his left side. Tabitha's fingers probed gently but with purpose. "Broken ribs," she murmured, "and one has punctured his lung." She looked up at Desmond, her expression grave. "I need to release the pressure or he'll suffocate. Hold him steady." From her bag, she extracted a thin metal tube and a small knife. Desmond placed his hands firmly on Jimmy's shoulders as Tabitha made a small incision between the boy's ribs. The men around them murmured nervously, but Tabitha worked with focused precision, inserting the tube into the incision. A rush of air and blood escaped, and almost immediately, Jimmy's breathing eased. Color began returning to his face. "I need to get him to the clinic," Tabitha said. "He's stable for now, but that lung needs proper treatment." Murphy stepped forward. "We'll get the wagon ready." For the next hour, Desmond worked alongside Tabitha, following her instructions without question as they stabilized Jimmy for transport. Her hands moved with practiced skill, her scars forgotten in the urgency of saving a life. When the wagon was ready, padded with blankets to cushion the jolting journey to town, Desmond helped her load the boy. "I'll ride with him," she said, climbing into the back of the wagon. "He'll need constant monitoring." "I'll come too," Desmond found himself saying. When she looked at him questioningly, he added, "In case you need help." The journey to town was slow and careful, with Desmond driving the team as gently as possible over the rutted road while Tabitha tended to Jimmy in the back. Occasionally, she would call out instructions, "Slow down here," or "Stop a moment. I need to check his breathing," and Desmond would comply without hesitation. It was near dusk when they finally reached the clinic. Dr. Wallace had returned and helped them bring Jimmy inside, his experienced eyes assessing the situation quickly. "You did well, Miss James," he said after examining the boy. "Quick thinking with the chest tube. You likely saved his life." Tabitha nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "He'll need careful watching tonight. The risk of infection is high." "I'll take the first watch," the doctor offered. "You get some rest. You've had quite a day." She turned to Desmond, who stood awkwardly by the door. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Hayes. I couldn't have managed without you." Desmond nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "The boy going to be all right?" With proper care, yes. He's young and strong. She studied him for a moment. Would you like some coffee? I was about to make some. He should refuse, he knew. Should return to the ranch and the simplicity of his solitary existence. Instead, he heard himself say, "Coffee would be good." Tabitha led him through to the small kitchen at the back of the clinic. As she busied herself with the stove and coffee pot, Desmond took a seat at the worn wooden table, feeling out of place in the domestic setting. "How long have you been nursing?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Formally, about 5 years," she replied, measuring coffee grounds. "But I've been tending to injuries since I was a girl. My father was the doctor in our town." "In Colorado?" She nodded. "A small mining town called Silverdale. What brought you to Arizona?" The coffee pot began to boil, and Tabitha focused on pouring the hot liquid into 2 chipped cups before answering. "A fresh start, I suppose. After the fire, things changed in Silverdale." She placed a cup before him and sat down across the table. The lamplight softened her scars somewhat, but they remained a stark testament to whatever tragedy had befallen her. "The fire that—" He gestured vaguely toward his own face. "Yes." She sipped her coffee. 3 years ago, I was treating patients in our home clinic when a miner came in, delirious with fever. He knocked over a lamp. The fire spread so quickly. Her eyes grew distant. I got my patients out but went back in for my father. The roof collapsed before we could escape. He didn't survive. Desmond's hand tightened around his cup. "I'm sorry. As am I." She met his gaze steadily. "Now, Mr. Hayes, I've shared my tragedy. Town gossip suggests you have one of your own." He stiffened, nearly rising from the table. But something in her direct gaze held him there. Not pity or morbid curiosity, but a simple understanding, the recognition of shared pain. "My wife and son," he said finally, the words like stones in his mouth. "5 years ago, raiders hit our homestead while I was in town." Tabitha waited, not pushing, simply giving him space to continue or stop as he chose. "Found them when I got back. Too late." His throat closed around the memories. She nodded, understanding what he couldn't say. "And that's when you stopped speaking?" "Didn't see much point anymore. Nothing worth saying. Yet here you are, speaking to me." She offered a small smile. "Why is that, I wonder?" Desmond had no answer. Or perhaps he did, but wasn't ready to acknowledge it. He drained his coffee and stood. "Should get back to the ranch. Tell the others how Jimmy's doing." Tabitha rose as well. "Of course. Thank you again for your help today." At the door, Desmond paused. "I'll check on the boy tomorrow, if that's all right." "We'd welcome the visit," she replied. "Good night, Mr. Hayes." Riding back to the Murphy Ranch under a canopy of stars, Desmond's mind churned with unfamiliar turmoil. For 5 years, he'd existed in a limbo of grief and silence, moving from place to place, taking work that required little interaction. Now, in the span of a single day, he'd spoken more than he had in months, all because of a woman with scars that matched his own, though hers were visible while his remained hidden. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Desmond would find reasons to ride into town, supplies needed, messages to deliver, checking on Jimmy's recovery. Each visit inevitably led him to the clinic, where Tabitha would offer coffee and conversation. At first, he spoke little, letting her carry the dialogue. But gradually, words came easier, rusty hinges beginning to move again with careful use. He learned that she was 32, unmarried. Her prospects diminished first by her dedication to her father's practice and then by the scars that made most men avert their eyes. She spoke of it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "I made my peace with it," she told him one evening as they sat on the clinic's back porch. "These scars saved lives. The patients I pulled from the fire all survived." Takes courage, Desmond said, to wear your scars so openly. She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. We all have scars, Mr. Hayes. Some are just more visible than others. Desmond, he corrected. Think we're past Mr. Hayes by now. She smiled, the expression transforming her face in the golden light of sunset. Desmond, then. As summer deepened into early fall, Desmond found himself opening up about his past. He told her about his wife, Sarah, and their son, Thomas, who had been just 4 when they died. He spoke of the small farm they'd built in Kansas, of Sarah's garden and Thomas's laughter. Words that had been locked away for years tumbled out, painful at first, then gradually less so. I used to tell Thomas stories every night, he admitted one evening. Made-up adventures about a boy and his horse exploring the frontier. Sarah said I had a gift for storytelling. I believe she was right, Tabitha said. You have a way with words, when you choose to use them. Haven't told a story since they've been gone. Tabitha's hand covered his where it rested on the porch railing. Perhaps someday you might again. The touch of her scarred hand on his sent an unexpected warmth through Desmond. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, beautiful in its imperfection. Something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed without words. The town noticed the change in the silent cowboy. Shopkeepers who had grown accustomed to his nods and gestures were startled to hear him speak, requesting items with please and thank you. At the saloon, where he occasionally stopped for a single drink, he would acknowledge greetings with words instead of nods. That nurse has worked some kind of miracle on Hayes, the barkeep commented one evening. Man's practically chatty now. Reckon there's something brewing there, another patron replied. Seen them walking together evenings. Quite the pair they make, the scarred nurse and the silent gunman. Word of their friendship spread through Pineshadow with the efficiency of all small-town gossip. Most viewed it with a mixture of curiosity and approval. Tabitha had earned the town's respect through her skilled care, and Desmond, despite his reputation, had proven himself a hard worker and fair man. Not everyone was supportive, however. Lloyd Garner, the town's banker and self-appointed moral guardian, made his disapproval known after church one Sunday. Miss James, he said, intercepting Tabitha on the church steps. A word, if you please. Desmond, who had taken to accompanying her to Sunday services, stopped beside her. Privately, Garner added, eyeing Desmond with thinly veiled distaste. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Mr. Hayes, Tabitha replied evenly. Garner straightened his already rigid posture. Very well. I feel it my duty to express concern about your association with certain elements in our town. As a medical professional, you have a position of responsibility. Your reputation, my reputation, Tabitha interrupted, is built on my skills as a nurse, not on who I choose as companions. But I thank you for your concern, Mr. Garner. She turned to leave, but Garner wasn't finished. A woman in your condition should be particularly careful about appearances. Given your unfortunate disfigurement, people might assume you're settling for less desirable company out of desperation. Desmond stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but Tabitha's touch on his arm stopped him. Mr. Garner, she said, her voice calm but carrying enough to draw the attention of nearby churchgoers. My unfortunate disfigurement, as you call it, has taught me to value character over appearance. Perhaps you might benefit from a similar lesson. She smiled pleasantly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plans for dinner. She tucked her hand into the crook of Desmond's arm and led him away, leaving Garner sputtering on the church steps. We have dinner plans? Desmond asked quietly as they walked toward the clinic. We do now, she replied with a small smile. Unless you have other engagements? He shook his head. No, madam. No other engagements. That dinner, a simple affair of beef stew and freshly baked bread in Tabitha's small quarters behind the clinic, marked another turning point. As they sat across from each other at her small table, the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that needed no filling. "Tell me a story," Tabitha said suddenly as they lingered over coffee. "One of the stories you used to tell your son." Desmond stiffened, the request catching him off guard. "Been a long time. I know, but I'd like to hear one." He looked into her expectant face and found he couldn't refuse. "All right. Let me think." He cleared his throat. "Once there was a boy named Tommy who lived on the edge of the Great Plains with his faithful horse, Thunderbolt." The story came haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as forgotten details returned to him. He told of Tommy and Thunderbolt discovering a hidden valley where buffalo still roamed freely, of their adventures avoiding a mountain lion and befriending an old Indian scout who taught Tommy the language of the birds. When he finished, Tabitha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That was beautiful, Desmond. Your son was lucky to have such stories. Been carrying them around all this time," he said quietly. "Didn't know if I could ever let them out again." "I'm glad you did." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Some things are too precious to keep locked away forever." Their eyes met, and Desmond felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years' hope, fragile but undeniable. Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned across the table and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch. Tabitha froze for an instant, then responded, her lips soft against his. When they pulled apart, her eyes searched his face. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "These scars are part of you," he finished. "And I'm finding I care for all of you, Tabitha James." October brought the first hints of winter to Pineshadow. Desmond had extended his stay at the Murphy Ranch indefinitely, taking on more responsibilities as Patrick Murphy's health began to fail. The old rancher, recognizing Desmond's competence and integrity, had begun to rely on him to manage much of the ranch operations. "Never thought I'd see the day," Murphy commented one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch. The silent gunslinger turned rancher, and courting the town nurse to boot. Desmond smiled slightly. "Life takes unexpected turns." "That it does, son. That it does." Murphy coughed, a deep, troubling sound that had been worsening in recent weeks. "Which brings me to a proposition for you." Desmond looked at him questioningly. "I'm not getting any younger, and this cough." Murphy shook his head. "Doc Wallace says my heart's wearing out. My boys have all found their own paths, none interested in ranching. I need someone to take over, someone who knows cattle and values hard work. You offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. Stay on, help me run things while I'm still kicking, then take over when I'm gone. Fair share of the profits now, and the ranch would be yours after." Desmond stared out at the land stretching before them, good grazing land with a reliable water source, a solid herd of cattle, and a reputation for quality that kept buyers coming back year after year. "It's a generous offer, Patrick. Need some time to think on it." Murphy nodded. "Take all the time you need, but I've seen how you look at this place, and how you look at that nurse of yours. Man needs roots to grow a future." That night, riding into town to see Tabitha as had become his custom several evenings a week, Desmond turned Murphy's words over in his mind. Roots, future, concepts he'd abandoned after losing Sarah and Thomas. Yet here they were again, possibilities unfolding before him like spring buds after a hard winter. He found Tabitha on her usual perch on the clinic's back porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. Her face brightened at the sight of him, and the now familiar warmth spread through his chest. "You're early," she said as he took his place beside her. "Had something to discuss." He told her about Murphy's offer, watching her face carefully for her reaction. A partnership? Desmond, that's wonderful. Her enthusiasm was genuine. Murphy couldn't have chosen better. You've transformed that place in just a few months. Would mean staying in Pineshadow. Permanently. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the hope in her eyes. Desmond took her hands in his, both the smooth one and the scarred one. Depends on what else might be here for me. Who else? Tabitha's breath caught. Desmond, I love you, Tabitha. Never thought I'd say those words again to anyone. Never thought I'd feel this way after Sarah. But here we are. Tears welled in her eyes. Are you certain? A life with me wouldn't be easy. People will always stare, always whisper. Let them, he said firmly. I spent 5 years in silence, running from memories. You brought me back, made me speak again, made me want to tell stories again, made me want to live again. He cupped her scarred cheek gently. I love you, scars and all. Hell, maybe because of them. They show your courage, your heart. Tabitha turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss there. I love you too. Have for months now, I think. Then marry me, he said, the words rushing out before he could reconsider. Be my wife. Help me build something here. For answer, she leaned forward and kissed him, pouring years of loneliness and newfound joy into the connection. When they finally parted, both breathless, she whispered against his lips, yes, 1,000 times yes. The wedding took place on the first Saturday of November, a crisp, clear day with the mountains in the distance outlined against a brilliant blue sky. The whole town turned out, filling the small church to capacity. Even Lloyd Garner made an appearance, though he sat in the back and departed immediately after the ceremony. Dr. Wallace gave the bride away, his weathered face beaming with pride as he walked Tabitha down the aisle. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, high-necked but elegant, her honey-brown hair adorned with tiny white flowers. For the occasion, she had made no attempt to hide her scars with powder or a veil, meeting the world and her groom with the same direct gaze that had first captured Desmond's attention. Desmond waited at the altar in a new black suit, his usually unruly dark hair tamed for the occasion, his face freshly shaven. Around his neck, visible above his collar, was the leather cord with Sarah's wedding ring, a detail that had initially concerned him, until Tabitha had assured him that honoring his first wife's memory was important to her as well. She helped make you the man I love, she had told him. I would never ask you to forget her. As they exchanged vows, Desmond's voice rang clear and strong through the church, a far cry from the man who had ridden into town months earlier, wrapped in silence and solitude. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Desmond pulled Tabitha into a kiss that brought cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued at the Murphy Ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard and a feast prepared by the women of the town. As the afternoon turned to evening, Patrick Murphy stood to make a toast. To Desmond and Tabitha Hayes, he said, raising his glass. Two souls who found each other against all odds. And to new beginnings, the ranch will now officially be the Murphy and Hayes operation, with these two to take it forward when I'm gone. Cheers erupted again, and Desmond stood, pulling Tabitha up beside him. Thank you all, he said, his arm around his new wife's waist, for welcoming us, for being part of this day. Some of you knew me only as the silent cowboy who passed through town. Thanks to this remarkable woman, I found my voice again. He looked down at Tabitha, his eyes filled with love, and a reason to use it. As the celebration continued into the night, with music and dancing under stars and lantern light, Desmond and Tabitha slipped away to a quiet corner of the porch. Happy, Mrs. Hayes? He asked, drawing her close. Incredibly so, Mr. Hayes. She rested her head against his chest. Though I must warn you, I expect stories every night. Now that you've found your voice again, I intend to keep you using it." He laughed, the sound still new but growing more natural each day. "I think I can manage that. Got years of stories saved up." "Good," she murmured, "because we have years ahead to share them." In the soft glow of the distant lanterns, they sealed the promise with a kiss, two scarred souls who had found healing in each other's broken places. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to the Hayes family. The Murphy and Hayes ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding its operations and reputation throughout the territory. When Patrick Murphy passed peacefully in his sleep the winter after their wedding, he left behind a thriving business and the knowledge that his legacy would continue. Tabitha maintained her nursing practice, dividing her time between the clinic in town and her duties at the ranch. Her reputation as a skilled healer grew, drawing patients from neighboring communities. The scars that had once made people turn away became a symbol of her resilience and compassion, earning respect rather than pity. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Patricia, arrived just over a year after their wedding. She had Tabitha's green eyes and Desmond's dark hair, and from her earliest days showed a determination that both parents recognized in themselves. When she was old enough to understand, they told her the stories of her namesake's Desmond's first wife and the rancher who had given them their start. 2 years later, Thomas Patrick joined the family, a sturdy boy with his mother's honey-brown hair and his father's quiet nature. Each night, Desmond would gather the children for stories, telling them the adventures of the boy Tommy and his horse Thunderbolt, keeping alive the memory of the son he had lost while creating new memories with the family he had found. As the children grew, so did the legends of their parents. In saloons and around campfires throughout the territory, people told the tale of the silent gunslinger who found his voice because of a scarred nurse, a story of second chances and healing that took on the quality of frontier mythology. Sometimes, travelers would pass through Pineshadow specifically to catch a glimpse of the couple who had defied expectations and built a life from the ashes of their separate tragedies. One such traveler appeared at the ranch on a summer afternoon 10 years after Desmond and Tabitha's wedding. Desmond was in the corral, working with a young horse, when a rider approached. Something about the man's bearing put Desmond on alert. He carried himself like a lawman or a soldier. "Mr. Hayes?" the stranger called, dismounting at the corral fence. Desmond nodded, handing the horse's lead to one of the ranch hands and approaching the visitor. "Can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "Marshal Daniel Cooper. I've ridden from Kansas." Desmond's heart stuttered. Kansas, the past he had finally made peace with. "What brings a Kansas marshal to Arizona?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Information that might interest you, sir." Cooper glanced around. "Is there somewhere we might speak privately?" Desmond led him to the ranch house porch, calling for Tabitha as they approached. She appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, her scars silvery in the afternoon light. "We have a visitor," Desmond said. "Marshal Cooper from Kansas." Understanding immediately flickered in Tabitha's eyes. "I'll bring some coffee." When they were settled with steaming cups, Cooper got to the point. "Mr. Hayes, I believe you lived in Harper County, Kansas about 15 years ago. Had a homestead that was raided. Lost your family." Desmond's jaw tightened. "That's right. Sir, we've apprehended the men responsible." Cooper's words hung in the air. "A gang led by brothers named Silas and Jeremiah Blackwood. They've been operating across Kansas, Colorado, and into the territories for years. Recently caught them after a bank robbery went wrong." Tabitha's hand found Desmond's, squeezing tightly. "During questioning, they confessed to numerous crimes, including the raid on your homestead. They're to stand trial next month in Topeka. Given the nature and number of their crimes, they'll almost certainly hang." Cooper paused. I came to inform you of this development and to ask if you'd be willing to testify. Desmond sat in stunned silence. For years after Sarah and Thomas's deaths, he had fantasized about finding the raiders, about exacting revenge with his own hands. That burning need for vengeance had eventually hollowed out into the silence that defined him until Tabitha entered his life. Now, the possibility of justice through legal means lay before him. I need to think on this, he said finally. Cooper nodded. Of course. I'll be in Pineshadow for 2 days before heading back. You can find me at the hotel. After the marshal departed, Desmond remained on the porch, staring out at the land that had become his home, the life he had built from the wreckage of his former existence. What are you thinking? Tabitha asked softly. That I never expected this. After all this time. He shook his head. Part of me wants to see justice done. Part of me wonders if reopening those wounds is worth it. Whatever you decide, I'm with you, she said. If you want to go to Kansas, we'll go as a family. Desmond turned to look at her. This woman who had healed him in ways he hadn't known possible. What would you do? She considered the question carefully. I would want closure. Not for vengeance, but to put the past truly to rest. That evening, after the children were asleep, Desmond told Tabitha every detail he could remember about the raid, things he had never spoken of before, not even to her. He described coming home to find the cabin burning, discovering Sarah's body by the garden gate where she had tried to flee with Thomas, finding his son's small form clutched in her arms. I buried them on the hill behind the cabin, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Under the oak tree where we used to picnic. Rode out the next morning and never looked back. Tabitha held him as the long-suppressed grief washed through him again, not with the raw agony of 15 years ago, but with the bittersweet ache of honoring those lost. The next morning, Desmond rode into town to find Marshal Cooper. His decision was made. I'll testify, he told the lawman. My wife and children will come with me. Cooper nodded. We'll leave in 3 days. That should give us plenty of time to reach Topeka before the trial begins. The journey to Kansas was long but uneventful. Sarah and Thomas, now 9 and 7, were excited by the adventure, peppering their father with questions about the place where he had grown up. Desmond found himself telling them stories of his youth in Kansas, of meeting their namesake at a county fair, of building the cabin where he had expected to spend his life. As they crossed into Kansas, Desmond felt a weight settling on his shoulders, not crushing, as he had feared, but the substantial presence of memory and responsibility. This was the land that had shaped him, that had seen his greatest joy and deepest sorrow. Returning now, with his new family beside him, was both a homecoming and a final reckoning with the past. The trial in Topeka drew crowds from across the state. The Blackwood brothers had terrorized the frontier for years, and their capture was considered a significant victory for law and order. Desmond's testimony came on the 3rd day, a straightforward account of what he had found upon returning to his homestead. He spoke clearly and without emotion, though Tabitha, sitting in the gallery with their children, could see the cost in the tight set of his shoulders. When he identified Silas Blackwood as a man he had glimpsed riding away from his burning property, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Blackwood's face showed no remorse, only a cold calculation as he studied the man whose life he had destroyed. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. The sentence, as Marshal Cooper had predicted, was death by hanging. As the Blackwood brothers were led from the courtroom, Silas turned to spit in Desmond's direction. Desmond merely watched him go, feeling not the satisfaction he had once craved, but a quiet relief that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. "Are you all right?" Tabitha asked as they left the courthouse. "Better than I expected," he replied honestly. "There's one more thing I need to do before we head home." The next day, They rented a wagon and drove to Harper County, to the land Desmond had once called home. The cabin was long gone, reclaimed by nature after years of abandonment. Only the stone chimney remained, standing like a monument among the encroaching trees. Desmond led his family up the hill to the oak tree, now 15 years larger than when he had dug 2 graves beneath its branches. The wooden markers he had hastily erected were gone, but Desmond knew exactly where they had been. "Sarah, Thomas," he said quietly, kneeling on the ground between the unmarked graves. "I brought someone to meet you." He gestured to Tabitha and the children to join him. "This is my wife, Tabitha, and our children, Sarah and Thomas." Young Sarah, understanding the solemnity of the moment, placed the wildflowers she had gathered on the ground. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm named after you." Thomas, less certain but wanting to participate, added a smooth stone he had found by the creek to the impromptu memorial. "Me too," he added. Tabitha knelt beside her husband, her scarred hand finding his. "Thank you for sharing him with us," she said to the earth beneath them. "We'll treasure him always." They remained there until sunset, Desmond telling his children stories of their namesakes, stories he had kept locked away for too long. As the light faded, he felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and wounds finally healed. "Time to go home," he said, rising and taking Tabitha's hand. "Are you sad to leave them?" young Thomas asked, looking back at the hill as they walked to the wagon. Desmond considered the question, then shook his head. "No, son. I carry them with me always. But home is where you and your sister and your mother are. That's where I belong now." The return journey to Arizona seemed shorter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from all of them. As they crossed back into the territory, Desmond found himself telling more stories not just of his first family, but of his own childhood, of adventures he'd had as a young man, of the years before silence had claimed him. The children listened eagerly, and Tabitha watched with love as the man she had married continued to emerge more fully from the shadows of his past. When they crested the final hill and the Murphy and Hayes ranch came into view, Desmond pulled the wagon to a halt. The adobe ranch house gleamed in the afternoon sun, smoke curling from the chimney where their foreman's wife would be preparing a welcome home meal. Cattle dotted the green pastures, and in the distance, the mountains stood as they always had, constant and enduring. "It's good to be home," Tabitha said, squeezing his hand. Desmond nodded, taking in the sight of all they had built together. "Yes," he said, his voice strong and clear, no longer the rusty whisper it had been when he first spoke to her outside the general store all those years ago. "It's good to be home." As they drove down toward the ranch, Desmond Hayes, once known as the Silent Cowboy, began another story, his voice carrying on the wind to his family and beyond, to the land that had given him a second chance at life and love. Many years later, when Desmond and Tabitha's grandchildren gathered around their porch in the evenings, they would beg for stories of the old days of how their grandfather had once been known for his silence, until their grandmother, a woman with scars, had made him tell stories again. And Desmond, his hair now silver but his voice still strong, would wink at Tabitha, her scars faded with age but still visible, and begin, "Once upon a time, a broken man rode into a small town called Pineshadow." And Tabitha would smile, knowing that of all the stories he told, this one, their story, was his favorite.